The accusation came out of nowhere, a police officer's voice cutting through the controlled hum of the Senate basement hallway, claiming Jasmine Crockett had done something she absolutely had not. The air conditioning unit overhead sighed a long mechanical breath, oblivious to the sudden sharp tension that had just been injected into the otherwise mundane passage between hearing rooms. It was the kind of space designed for function, not drama. Low ceilings, muted carpet, framed legislative maps that nobody ever looked at. But for a split second, as the officer's voice carried sharp and official, every molecule in that hallway seemed to freeze. He was a large man, solid in his dark blue uniform, standing near the security checkpoint entrance. His face was set in an expression of practiced authority, one that rarely admitted doubt. He pointed directly at Jasmine, who had been walking briskly, head slightly down, reviewing a printed document in her hands alongside her aide, a young woman named Sarah. "Ma'am, you need to step aside. We have a report of an unauthorized item you attempted to bring through." His voice wasn't loud, but it had that carrying quality, the sort that commanded attention in quiet spaces. Jasmine stopped instantly. Her movement went from forward momentum to absolute stillness in less than a heartbeat. She didn't flinch, didn't react defensively. Her eyes lifted from the document, settling first on the officer's face, then, for just a fraction of a second, down to his name tag and badge number. She didn't raise her eyebrows, didn't sigh in exasperation. Nothing outwardly gave away the sudden shift in her reality. It was an interruption, a jarring dissonance in the carefully orchestrated flow of her day. But it was also something else, something she recognized instantly in the pit of her stomach, the familiar cold weight of being unjustly targeted. Sarah beside her, however, did react. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm, looking from the officer to Jasmine, a silent question forming on her face. Her hand instinctively reached out, a small protective gesture towards Jasmine's arm, stopping short of making contact. Other people in the hallway, aides and staffers mostly, people used to the quiet efficiency of the building, also stopped. They didn't make a show of it, just paused their own trajectories, their gazes drawn by the unexpected assertion of authority in their predictable environment. The officer stood his ground, his posture rigid, expecting compliance, perhaps even expecting an argument, a denial, some form of immediate pushback. But Jasmine offered none of that. She simply stood there, her hands still holding the folded document, her expression unreadable, giving him nothing to push against. The silence that stretched between them was thick, heavy with unspoken context, the kind of silence that happens when power is asserted and the expected reaction isn't delivered. It was a silence that began to attract more attention than any shout ever would have. People shifted their weight, glanced at each other, then back at the tableau forming near the security point. A few pulled out their phones, not overtly recording yet, but holding them loosely, ready. The officer, perhaps sensing the lack of an expected response, or perhaps just adhering to a procedure he believed was unfolding correctly, took a small step forward. "Ma'am, the report stated you attempted to bypass screening with something concealed. We need to verify." His tone was firm, bordering on insistent. Jasmine's gaze remained steady on him. It wasn't accusatory or challenging, just observant. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that expands the chest almost imperceptibly, anchoring oneself. The folded document remained still in her hands. She hadn't dropped it, hadn't clutched it tighter, hadn't made any sudden movements that could be misinterpreted. She was simply present, absorbing the accusation, processing it with a quiet intensity that was far more commanding than any verbal defense would have been in that moment. Sarah's alarm hadn't lessened, but she took her cue from Jasmine's stillness, remaining silent, her eyes still darting between the officer and her boss, a silent, anxious echo of the building tension. The hallway lights hummed, the air conditioning continued its soft sigh, but the human element had been suspended, waiting for the next beat. Jasmine's voice, when it finally came, was quiet, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion, at least on the surface. It was the voice of someone requesting clarification, not defending against an attack. "Officer," she began, her tone steady, "could you please specify who made this report and what item you believe I attempted to bring through?" She didn't raise her voice, didn't lean forward, didn't make any gesture of impatience or disbelief. It was a simple question delivered factually, but it carried in weight that seemed to surprise the officer. He paused for a moment, his confident posture faltering just slightly. He hadn't expected questions, not like that. He'd expected a denial, an explanation, maybe some indignation. He wasn't used to someone meeting a direct accusation with such calm, procedural inquiry. "The report came from a checkpoint observer," he said, his voice regaining some of its official cadence, though a hint of uncertainty now flickered in his eyes. "And the item, it was described as a metallic object, possibly in a pocket or bag." He gestured vaguely towards her suit jacket pocket. Jasmine's gaze remained fixed on him. She didn't check her pocket, didn't pat herself down. She knew exactly what she had on her person, and none of it fit that description. Her composure wasn't feigned. It was rooted in the absolute certainty of her own actions. Sarah, beside her, seemed to regain her footing slightly. She took a small step back, creating a little more space, her eyes still observing everything, processing the interaction with a fierce, quiet loyalty. The small cluster of bystanders had grown slightly. More people had stopped, pretending to look at their phones or talk to colleagues, but their attention was clearly focused on the scene. The air felt heavier, charged not with aggression, but with a strange mix of confusion and anticipation. They were witnessing something unexpected, a confrontation where one party was calm, and the other, the one with the official authority, was beginning to appear less certain. The officer shifted his weight. "Ma'am, it's standard procedure. If you could just allow me to conduct a brief check." He took another step forward, his hand moving towards his belt, not towards his weapon, but a gesture that implied he might reach for a search-related tool, or simply wanted to guide her towards a more private screening area. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands remained still, holding the document. Her gaze was still steady, but now perhaps there was a subtle intensity in her eyes, something that communicated her full attention, her complete unwillingness to let this moment pass without clarity. "Officer," she repeated, her voice still soft but firm, "before any further action, could you please confirm the specific checkpoint observer? And if you are relying on visual observation, I believe there are cameras covering this area that could verify." It was another simple procedural question, but it was delivered like a surgical strike. She wasn't arguing or resisting. She was requesting due process, and in doing so, she was subtly highlighting the potential flaws in the initial accusation. The officer's face flushed almost imperceptibly. The mention of cameras seemed to land heavily. His authority, which had seemed so solid moments ago, was beginning to feel less like a shield and more like thin glass under her quiet scrutiny. He looked around for a moment, perhaps scanning for the observer he'd mentioned, or perhaps just trying to regain his composure under the growing number of silent observers. The hum of the hallway lights seemed louder now, or maybe it was just the sound of the air itself vibrating with the unspoken tension. The officer didn't respond immediately to her question about the camera footage. He seemed momentarily stuck. The officer cleared his throat, a small dry sound in the quiet hallway. He didn't answer the question about the cameras directly. Instead, he pivoted slightly, his official demeanor beginning to fray around the edges. "Look, ma'am, we just need to resolve this quickly. It's a matter of security protocol." His tone was less authoritative now, more like someone trying to navigate an unexpected snag. "If you'll just cooperate, we can clear this up." He still wasn't aggressive, but there was a new undertone of urgency, a desire to wrap this up without further complication, especially with more and more people watching. Jasmine didn't change her posture. She remained perfectly still, a picture of calm immobility. The document was still held loosely in her hands. Sarah watched the officer intently, her earlier alarm replaced by a quiet determination, ready to step forward if needed, but also clearly trusting Jasmine's handling of the situation. The bystanders weren't even pretending anymore. A dozen or so people were now openly observing, some with visible curiosity, others with expressions of concern or suspicion. The glow of phone screens was more apparent now. Several people were holding them low, angled discreetly but undoubtedly recording. The officer noticed the phones. His gaze flickered over the onlookers and his face tightened almost imperceptibly. The dynamic was shifting. He had initiated a confrontation expecting immediate, perhaps flustered compliance or defensive pushback. Instead, he was met with quiet, procedural questioning and the silent jury of a hallway crowd, many of whom recognized Jasmine. Her composure was doing more to challenge his authority than any protest could have. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't accused him, hadn't even shown annoyance. She had simply asked for facts and process. "Officer," Jasmine said again, her voice still measured, "my understanding is that security protocols include clear identification of the basis for suspicion. You've mentioned a report and a description, but you haven't identified the source or confirmed if camera footage aligns. Before I comply with a search or further questioning based on what appears to be a mistaken report, I need that clarity." It was a longer statement than her previous ones, but delivered with the same calm precision. It wasn't a demand. It was a statement of requirements, laid out simply and undeniably. She was using the language of the institution against a potentially flawed application of its rules. The officer seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He looked towards the security checkpoint he had emerged from, then back at Jasmine. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, frustration, doubt, a dawning realization. The weight of her calm insistence and the silent, watchful crowd was pressing in on him. He rubbed the back of his neck, a small human gesture that broke his rigid posture. He hadn't expected this level of calm, informed resistance. He'd expected someone who might be intimidated, or at least flustered into immediate compliance. Jasmine's stillness, her quiet request for verification, was disarming him in a way that anger never could have. The hallway remained silent except for the persistent hum of the building systems and the almost inaudible click of phone cameras. The tension hadn't broken. It had simply changed form, becoming less about a direct challenge to authority and more about the slow, deliberate dismantling of a flawed premise through quiet, factual engagement. The officer took a small step back this time, putting a little more distance between them. He seemed to be recalculating, the initial certainty draining from his posture. The officer hesitated for a long moment, clearly unsure how to proceed. He glanced again at the people holding phones, their silent observation a palpable pressure. He ran a hand over his chin, his eyes scanning the hallway as if searching for someone to intervene or confirm his initial information. "Look, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, losing its official edge. "Maybe there was a misunderstanding. The description, it was kind of vague." He was backtracking, not explicitly admitting fault yet, but creating space for doubt in his own initial statement. It was a subtle shift, but everyone watching noticed it. Jasmine still didn't move. She didn't offer an easy out, didn't jump in to agree that it must have been a misunderstanding. She simply waited, her gaze steady. Her lack of immediate relief or eager agreement amplified the officer's awkwardness. Sarah remained watchful beside her, her expression mirroring the quiet intensity of the moment. The bystanders exchanged glances. A few lowered their phones slightly, intrigued by the sudden de-escalation coming from the officer, juxtaposed with Jasmine's continued quiet demand for clarity. The moment was becoming less about a potential security breach and more about the officer's handling of the situation under quiet scrutiny. "A vague description, officer," Jasmine finally spoke, her voice still calm, but now carrying a subtle, almost imperceptible edge of pointed inquiry. "And based on that vague description, without confirmation from camera footage or a clear source, you decided to stop and accuse me, specifically?" She wasn't raising her voice, but the structure of her sentence, the quiet emphasis on me specifically, hung in the air, carrying the unspoken weight of everything that such a specific, potentially baseless accusation against her could imply. It wasn't an accusation of malice, but a quiet, factual observation of the process that had just unfolded. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The space he had tried to create for a simple misunderstanding was being filled by her precise, calm detailing of his actions. He visibly swallowed. "Ma'am, I was just following up on a report," he mumbled, his gaze dropping from hers for a second. It was a weak defense, and he seemed to know it. His authority was eroding with each word he spoke, or failed to speak. The visual symbol of his discomfort, the lowered gaze, the shifting weight, the hand rubbing his chin, was stark against Jasmine's continued stillness and steady eye contact. This was the point where the quiet tension began to turn, where the power dynamic, initially weighted heavily on the side of the uniformed authority figure, began to tilt, not through confrontation, but through composure meeting lack of substance. The silence that followed her question felt different this time, less about anticipation, more about the officer's clear inability to offer a satisfactory response. The audience of onlookers didn't speak, but their collective attention was a powerful force, a silent jury witnessing the unraveling of a simple security stop into something potentially more significant. The officer seemed cornered, not by aggression, but by the calm, factual mirror Jasmine held up to his actions. The hallway hummed, the lights shone, and the quiet, awkward moment stretched, amplifying the resonance of Jasmine's simple question. The officer's discomfort was now palpable. He looked genuinely flustered, his earlier confidence completely gone. He avoided Jasmine's direct gaze, looking instead at the floor, at the wall, anywhere but at the composed woman who had dismantled his authority with quiet questions and stillness. He mumbled something inaudible. "Excuse me, officer?" Jasmine prompted gently, her voice still calm, forcing him to articulate whatever he had just said. He looked up quickly, a flicker of something akin to desperation in his eyes. I said I might have been mistaken," he stammered, the words tumbling out awkwardly. "About the report or who it was about. It happens sometimes." He was trying to sound casual, professional even, but the visible strain on his face betrayed the effort. He was not only acknowledging a potential error, but admitting it publicly, under the gaze of a growing number of witnesses. This wasn't just backtracking. It was the beginning of a climb down. Sarah exchanged a quick, silent glance with Jasmine. There was no triumph in her eyes, just a quiet acknowledgement of the shift. The bystanders were now fully engaged, their phones still recording, their expressions a mix of surprise and knowing nods. They were witnessing the moment when official certainty crumbled under the weight of calm scrutiny. This was the quiet climax of the immediate interaction, the point where the anticipated narrative of resistance and authority collided with something unexpected, dignity and process. And dignity was winning. "You might have been mistaken," Jasmine repeated softly, her tone flat, devoid of judgment, simply stating his words back to him. It was a rhetorical device she used with devastating effect, repeating a key phrase with subtle emphasis, allowing the weight of the words to land with new meaning. "So you stopped a member of Congress in a secure building, based on a vague, possibly mistaken report, without confirming it via available camera footage." She didn't ask it as a question. She stated it as a summary of the facts he had just implicitly conceded. It was a quiet, delayed rhetorical hammer, landing not with noise but with undeniable force. This statement, delivered with such calm precision in front of witnesses and recording phones, was the viral, quotable moment. It encapsulated the entire interaction. The baseless accusation, the procedural failure, the calm response, and the officer's retreat, into one clear, devastatingly accurate sentence. It was likely already being clipped and shared by the people in the hallway. The officer paled slightly. He understood the implications of her summary, spoken aloud in this public space. It wasn't just a personal error. It was a potential procedural failure, a lapse in judgment that could have consequences far beyond this hallway. His earlier desire to simply resolve this quickly had backfired spectacularly, not because Jasmine had made a scene, but because she hadn't. Her calmness had forced the scene into existence around his actions. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. There was nothing he could say to refute her summary. He was trapped by the simple, factual account she had just laid out, an account witnessed and recorded by everyone present. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with the officer's defeat and the quiet power of Jasmine's unshakable composure. The hum of the building system seemed distant now, background noise to the human drama that had unfolded and was now, in a strange, quiet way, concluding its first act. The officer stood there, exposed not by an opponent's attack, but by his own actions reflected in the calm, clear light of Jasmine's dignity. The officer finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, a stark contrast to the confident tone he had used just minutes earlier. He wasn't just backtracking anymore. He was stumbling, trying to find a way out of the situation his own actions and Jasmine's composure had created. "Ma'am, Congresswoman, I sincerely apologize." The words were forced, heavy with humiliation. He shifted his weight again, his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. "There was a misunderstanding, a clear error on my part. I acted too quickly based on incomplete information." He still avoided her direct gaze for the most part, glancing up only fleetingly before looking down again. It was a public apology, delivered in a public space, under the silent, watchful eyes of the bystanders who were now actively recording, their phones held higher and more openly. Sarah stood quietly beside Jasmine, her expression neutral, observing the officer's discomfort. She wasn't gloating. There was no need. The moment spoke for itself. Jasmine remained still, her hand still holding the folded document. She didn't visibly react to the apology, didn't nod or offer a sympathetic look. She simply absorbed the words, allowing the weight of his admission to settle in the space between them. The quiet dignity of her posture amplified the sincerity, or lack thereof, of his apology. He was clearly uncomfortable, perhaps regretting his actions, but also undoubtedly aware of the scrutiny he was under and the potential repercussions. His discomfort wasn't just about being proven wrong. It was about being proven wrong publicly, by someone who had maintained their grace while his own had evaporated. "Based on incomplete information," Jasmine repeated softly, echoing another key phrase from his stumbling apology. She wasn't accepting the apology yet, merely acknowledging his words. "And you stopped a member of Congress, a black woman, in a secure building, based on that incomplete information and a vague description." She added the element he had omitted, the silent variable that often underpinned such misunderstandings. She didn't accuse him of racial bias explicitly, but by stating the facts of who she was alongside the facts of how he had acted, she allowed the audience to draw their own conclusions. It was another quiet, powerful moment, layering the specific incident with broader societal implications. The officer flinched slightly at her words. He didn't deny the observation. He couldn't. He simply stood there, taking it in, the reality of the situation settling upon him. His apology was now evolving from a simple admission of error to something potentially deeper, prompted by her quiet, factual framing. He looked genuinely remorseful, perhaps seeing the incident not just as a procedural mistake, but through the lens she had just provided. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice even quieter now, a bare acknowledgement. "Yes, it was wrong. My approach, it was wrong." He was admitting more than just a procedural error. He was acknowledging a failure in judgment, perhaps even a failure in recognizing or respecting her position and person. This was the moment that went beyond a simple apology for being wrong and moved towards a recognition of the potential harm and implications of his actions. The air in the hallway felt less tense now, replaced by a heavy, reflective quiet. The performance of authority had collapsed, leaving behind a moment of raw, awkward reckoning. The officer took a hesitant step closer, lowering his voice further, as if trying to create a bubble of privacy in the very public space where he had just been humbled. "Congresswoman, I truly am sorry," he reiterated, his gaze finally meeting hers, briefly before dropping again. "That shouldn't have happened. I let procedure override common sense, and I didn't consider enough." His words were still awkward, but they carried a greater sense of genuine regret than his initial stammered apology. He was attempting to articulate the source of his error, hinting at the factors he had failed to consider, without explicitly naming the societal context that Jasmine had quietly introduced. It was an implicit acknowledgement of the layers at play. Jasmine remained still, her face unreadable. She wasn't offering comfort or absolution. She was simply receiving his apology, allowing him the space to deliver it fully, to sit in the discomfort of his own admission. Sarah watched him, her expression still calm but watchful, a silent witness to the unfolding scene. The bystanders continued to observe, though the intensity of their focus had shifted from anticipation to a quiet, almost somber witnessing of the officer's public reckoning. The sound of phones was less prominent now. The focus was on the quiet exchange between Jasmine and the officer. This was not virality for spectacle, but virality born of genuine human, if awkward, interaction under duress. Jasmine finally broke her silence. "Officer," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a weight that was both acknowledging and subtly challenging. "Mistakes happen. But when those mistakes involve questioning someone's integrity, their presence in a space where they have every right to be, based on vague information and without proper verification, the impact is significant." She wasn't lecturing him, but stating a fact, outlining the consequence of his actions beyond the immediate inconvenience. "Especially," she added softly, her gaze steady now, locking onto his, "when those same mistakes seem to happen more often to some people than others." It was a quiet, devastating line, delivered without anger, without accusation, but with the full weight of historical and present reality behind it. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system, the patterns, the subtle biases that lead to moments like this. The officer visibly winced. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in her statement. He couldn't deny it. He stood there, a physical manifestation of the institutional tendency toward such errors, confronted by the quiet power of her lived experience and her refusal to let the moment pass without that crucial context. His regret seemed to deepen, becoming not just personal but systemic. He was standing in the hallway, stripped of his authority by his own actions and the calm, dignified presence of the woman he had wrongly accused. The silence that enveloped them now was one of shared understanding, not of agreement, but of the raw, undeniable truth that had just been spoken. The officer stood there, absorbing Jasmine's quiet words, the weight of them settling heavily on him. He didn't offer excuses or explanations. There were none that could diminish the truth of what she had said. He simply nodded again, a slow, deliberate movement that acknowledged the layers of context she had added to the interaction. "Yes, Congresswoman," he said, his voice low and rough. I understand." It was a simple statement, but coming after everything that had transpired, it felt significant. It felt like a recognition, a moment of clarity forged in the discomfort of public humiliation. He looked genuinely contrite, not just performing an apology, but seemingly internalizing the implications of his actions. He glanced around at the bystanders again, their presence no longer a threat, but perhaps a reminder of the visibility of his mistake and his subsequent admission of error. Jasmine held his gaze for another moment, a silent communication passing between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever in the sense of wiping the slate clean, but a recognition of the moment itself. She wasn't there to personally forgive him or make him feel better. She was there to ensure the truth of the situation was seen and acknowledged. "I hope," Jasmine said finally, her voice soft but clear, "that this moment serves as a lesson, not just for you, officer, but for the system you represent. That assumptions are verified, that protocol is applied fairly, and that the dignity of every individual is respected." It was a final statement of purpose, elevating the incident beyond a personal exchange into a commentary on institutional responsibility. She wasn't asking for anything from him personally anymore. She was speaking to the larger structure. It was another powerful, reflective moment, underscoring the themes of dignity under scrutiny and the constant need for vigilance against casual bias. The officer nodded again, his head bowed slightly. He didn't respond verbally, perhaps recognizing that there was nothing more for him to say. He had offered his apology, had it accepted in the stoic manner she chose, and had received her quiet but firm summation of the broader issues. The immediate confrontation was over. The officer took a step back, then another, creating distance. He gave a small, formal nod to Jasmine, then a quick, almost shy glance at Sarah and the bystanders, before turning and walking slowly back towards the security checkpoint he had emerged from. His posture was different now, less rigid, more subdued. The hallway began to stir again. The spell was broken. People began to move, their conversations resuming, though perhaps in a slightly quieter tone. The glow of phone screens diminished as people put them away. Sarah let out a quiet breath she seemed to have been holding. She looked at Jasmine, a silent question in her eyes. "Are you okay? What just happened?" Jasmine gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The folded document was still in her hands. The incident was over, the public reckoning complete. But the feeling of it, the echo of the false accusation and the weight of the quiet correction, lingered in the air like a fading vibration. The hallway was just a hallway again, but something had fundamentally shifted within it. Jasmine didn't immediately resume walking. She stood there for a few more seconds, simply breathing, allowing the adrenaline that had been a silent current beneath her composure to dissipate. Sarah stepped closer, her concern evident. "Congresswoman, are you all right?" she whispered, her hand gently touching Jasmine's arm this time. Jasmine turned to her, a faint, almost weary smile touching her lips. "I'm fine, Sarah," she said softly. "Just another Tuesday." The sardonic humor was minimal, observational, highlighting the unfortunate regularity of such moments. But the weariness in her tone was real. Maintaining that level of calm dignity under baseless scrutiny, constantly having to hold space for the truth when confronted with error or bias, took a toll, even when successful. She folded the document she still held more tightly, the action symbolic of bringing the moment to a close. They began walking again, the hallway regaining its purposeful hum around them. As they walked, Jasmine's thoughts turned over the incident. It had been swift, unexpected, and deeply uncomfortable. The officer's initial confidence, his quick assumption of wrongdoing based on a vague report, was a familiar pattern. It was the microaggression writ large, the institutional tendency to see suspicion where none existed, especially when looking at certain faces. Her decision not to react immediately, not to argue or raise her voice, had been instinctual, born of years of experience. She knew that any visible frustration or anger would have instantly been weaponized against her, used to paint her as difficult, aggressive, validating the very biases that likely contributed to the officer's initial suspicion. Her power, her path to vindication lay in her absolute control, in her adherence to facts and process, in her refusal to give him the reaction he might have been subconsciously expecting. The onlookers with their phones had been crucial. Their silent witness had transformed a private inconvenience into a public event, increasing the pressure on the officer to confront the reality of his error. The viral quote, the simple statement summarizing his actions based on his own admissions, would ensure the moment had a life beyond that hallway. It would serve as a timestamp, a clear example of how easy it was for authority to overstep, and how quietly powerful it was to meet that overstep with calm, factual clarity. She hadn't set out to make a viral moment. She had simply set out to navigate a baseless accusation with her dignity intact. But the dignity itself, the quiet strength in the face of injustice, was what made it resonate. It wasn't about winning a confrontation. It was about holding on to truth, about refusing to be erased or defined by someone else's mistake or bias. That was the real victory. As they reached the end of the hallway, moving towards the next item on their schedule, the weight of the incident didn't disappear, but it shifted. It became less about the immediate discomfort, and more about the enduring lesson, the quiet power of standing firm, fact by fact, against the tide of assumption. Later that day, or perhaps the next morning, after the viral clip had spread and commentary had erupted online, Jasmine reflected on the incident again, maybe in the quiet of her office or during a brief pause between meetings. The clip of her saying, "So, you stopped a member of Congress in a secure building, based on a vague, possibly mistaken report, without confirming it via available camera footage," had been widely shared, accompanied by headlines highlighting the officer's subsequent apology. The commentary was predictable. Praise for her composure, outrage at the officer's actions, debate about systemic bias, and inevitably, some attempting to dismiss or downplay the incident. But the core of the moment, the quiet strength that had disarmed authority, resonated deeply with many. She hadn't needed to shout or demand. She had simply needed to be present, clear, and unwavering in her pursuit of truth and process. The visual symbols of the moment, her still hands, the officers fidgeting, the glint of phone screens capturing it all, had become etched into the narrative. The emotional beats had played out exactly as they often did in such encounters, albeit with a swifter public reckoning than usual. The subtle insult, the baseless accusation, her decision not to react defensively, Sarah's initial alarm mirroring the viewers, the bystanders noticing and recording, the viral quote crystallizing the issue, her quiet reframing of the narrative to include the broader context. the audience re-evaluating the officer's actions based on her calm response and the emotional ripple effect leading to this reflective closure. It wasn't about the officer as an individual villain. He was a part of a larger system, a system prone to errors in judgment, particularly when interacting with certain demographics. His visible discomfort and eventual apology, while perhaps prompted by public scrutiny, also spoke to the possibility of personal realization within that system. The reversal phrasing she had used, the callback lines echoing his own words with new power, the symbolic micro-actions, they were tools she wielded not for performance, but for clarity and impact. The humor was minimal, only appearing in the weary irony of her "just another Tuesday" comment, a shared understanding of the burden of constantly having to prove one's right to exist and be respected. The emotional reward for the audience wasn't seeing someone defeated, but seeing dignity prevail. The virality trigger was that quiet, devastatingly factual summary. The comment fodder was the very nature of the interaction, the restraint, the power dynamics, the undeniable truth of her final quiet statement about who this happens to more often. This incident, like others before it, was a reminder that power wasn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it was the calmest, the clearest, the most quietly unwavering. And that kind of power was undeniable. The incident faded from the immediate headlines eventually, replaced by the next news cycle, the next viral moment. But for those who watched the clip, who saw the quiet strength in Jasmine Crockett's eyes as she stood accused and calmly dismantled the accusation, something lingered. It wasn't just a story about a police officer making a mistake. It was a story about how dignity holds its ground when challenged. It was a story about the power of silence, the weight of truth, and the quiet, relentless force of grace under pressure. It was a reminder that composure wasn't a lack of feeling, but a profound form of control, a shield and a sword wielded with quiet precision. The officer's public apology, delivered in that awkward hallway moment, became a symbol, not of his personal failure alone, but of the system's capacity, however reluctantly, to acknowledge error when confronted by undeniable truth and unwavering dignity. People would recall the clip, not just for the initial accusation, but for the quiet way it was handled, the subtle shifts in power, the moment the officer's confidence evaporated under the steady gaze of the woman he had wrongly stopped. It reinforced the understanding that standing tall didn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just required standing still, speaking truth softly, and letting the facts do the work. The story became part of the larger narrative of navigating systems that weren't always built to see you fully, to respect your presence automatically. It was a lesson delivered not from a podium, but in a quiet hallway, under fluorescent lights, witnessed by a handful of people with cell phones. And perhaps that made the lesson even more powerful. It was real, unscripted, and deeply human in its awkwardness and its quiet strength. The ripple effect wasn't just in the online commentary. It was in the quiet conversations sparked, the moments of recognition shared between those who understood intimately what it meant to be unfairly targeted, and the quiet admiration from those who simply witnessed a remarkable display of grace. The reflective closure wasn't an ending, but a pause, a moment to absorb the lesson and carry it forward. If this story moved you, share it, not to go viral, but to remind people what dignity looks like.